Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm so glad each one of you are here today, and I think that you're going to be in for a treat. So thanks for coming. I am sure that most of you are familiar with the name Susan B. Anthony, and you probably recognize Elizabeth Cady Stanton as founders of the women's suffrage movement. But have you ever heard of Matilda Joslyn Gage in that respect? Me neither, until I got acquainted with her. Although Matilda worked together with those other two for decades, they had a falling out a lot later in life. Matilda died first, and after her death, her so-called two friends actively worked to write her out of history. So that's why you may not have heard of her. So we're going to travel back in time as Matilda joins us to share her story and some of her speeches that she presented during the fight for women's rights. So we're welcoming Matilda Joslyn Gage.
Picture, if that's okay?
Thank you.
Can I take a picture? Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. It looks as though styles have changed quite a bit since my time. Some of you appear to be wearing bloomers. I never wore bloomers as outerwear, but a lot of women did, and it was a symbol of the women's rights movement. My friend, thank you. She had a pink dotted Swiss bloomer outfit. It raised some eyebrows, I'll tell you. But you didn't invite me here to talk about clothes. I see you have one of my diaries here. That's good. That'll help me remember dates, my speeches. And this is the book that is my biography.
Well, tell us a little more about your book and how it came to be.
The title came from a letter I wrote to my son. I was arrested in 1893, and when the sheriff came to the door to arrest me, all the crimes that I was not guilty of rushed through my mind, but I failed to remember that I had been born a criminal. I'm not used to these things. I had been born a criminal because I was born a woman. My parents raised me to be a fight for women's rights, for rights of everyone, because they had been strong advocates of the abolition of slavery. Our home was a station on the Underground Railroad, and I spent many hours listening to people speak on the subject, even as a child. My father was a doctor, and I wanted to grow up to be a doctor just like him. But when I started to apply to medical schools, none of them would accept me. Women were just not allowed higher education or to be in a profession, even if they needed it to support themselves. So instead of becoming a doctor, I married Henry Gage. He was a businessman who agreed with my views on human rights. In those days, women weren't allowed to speak in public. That's why I don't know anything about a microphone. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't serve on juries. They simply were kept silent. If they earned any money or inherited any money, it belonged to their husbands, and they couldn't own property or sign a contract. And their husbands were allowed to starve them, beat them, lock them up in insane asylums or prisons, or even just throw them out in the street with nothing. If a marriage ended, a woman had no rights to her children. And if an unmarried woman owned property, she had to pay plenty of taxes.
That is appalling. I didn't realize it was so bad. What steps were you inspired to take?
Well, I rushed in to set things to right. And I wasn't the only one. There were other women who agreed with me. The first Women's Rights Convention was held in 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York. And it was just 50 miles from where I lived. But I'd given birth to my son, Clarkson, on the 18th of July. So I wasn't able to attend, obviously. The convention was organized by Lucretia Mott, a well-known Quaker abolitionist, and by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was mentioned before. She was a writer who lived in Seneca Falls. 300 men and women gathered in a church, and they passed a declaration that said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal."
So how did you know so much about the convention happenings when you weren't able to be there?
Oh, I read about it in the newspapers. I love to read newspapers, and I would often cut out articles about women's rights and other things to put in scrapbooks like this one. I attended my first Women's Rights Convention in 1852, and there I gave my first speech. And I must say my speech caused a sensation. Instead of focusing on what women might do if they were given the chance, I described what famous women in history had accomplished. And here is how I ended the speech. "We need not expect the concessions demanded by women will be peaceably granted. There will be a long moral warfare before the citadel yields. In the meantime, let us take possession of the outposts, use discussion, newspaper articles, and petitions. All great reforms are gradual. Fear not any attempt to frown down the revolution already commenced. Nothing is a more fertile aid of reform than an attempt to check it. Work on, onward, let the truth prevail." And that's also where I met Susan B. Anthony, the lady with the pink dotted Swiss Boobler outfit. It was her first women's rights convention, too. She'd been involved in the temperance movement before that, but when she went to a temperance convention and realized that women would not be allowed to speak, she walked out and joined the women's rights movement instead.
Huh. She's feisty. Did you keep speaking in public then?
Oh, after that, I began speaking often in public, which was a shocking thing for a woman to do at the time. And I traveled to conventions, even though it was considered improper for a woman to travel alone. I always carried two petitions, one advocating women's rights in general, and a second one advocating a woman's right to vote. Some people would sign the first one, but not the second, because women's voting was quite controversial at the time.
Well, speaking of controversies, did you continue working during the Civil War?
The Civil War, well, we suspended meeting during the war, and the women were kind of needed to raise money and gather medical supplies for the North. After the war, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony started a newspaper called The Revolution, and I became one of its primary writers. We celebrated the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ended slavery. Many groups had worked together to make those changes, and I hoped that the same people would collaborate and win equal rights for women. But the next two amendments proved troublesome. The first part of the 14th Amendment, anyway, saying that all those who were born in the United States are citizens, seemed good. And many women thought it applied to them too. But it made discrimination official. Only men could vote. The 15th Amendment, which granted voting rights regardless of race, color, and previous condition of servitude, could have said regardless of sex too, but it didn't.
Well, what else did you do personally?
Oh, well, in 1871, I tried to vote in Fayetteville. I had 9 women with me in the sitting room of the hotel where the voting was taking place. I went down first to the bar room where they were doing the voting, and I offered my vote. It was refused on the ground that I was a married woman. So then I took down 2 single women who owned their homes, paid their taxes, supported themselves, and their votes were refused also. So then I took down some war widows whose husbands had died on the battlefields of the Civil War, fighting for their country. They too were refused, and so on through the whole 9. With each one I made an argument and had a big and attentive crowd to listen, but we didn't get to vote. Now, in Rochester, Susan B. Anthony did vote and was promptly arrested. That made headlines. Susan loved to make headlines. I sat with her at the trial at the courthouse, and here's what I wrote about it later in the paper. On the bench sat Judge Hunt, a small-brained, pale-faced, prim-looking man enveloped in a faultless suit of black broadcloth and a snowy white necktie. This was the first criminal case that he had been called on to try since his appointment, and with remarkable forethought, he had penned his decision before he ever heard the case. That's right, he'd written it out and put it in his pocket. And then, when the lawyers had finished presenting their cases, he took it out and read, "Gentlemen of the jury, 2 principles apply here. First, ignorance of the law excuses no one. Second, every person is presumed to understand and to intend the necessary effects of his own acts. Miss Anthony knew that she was a woman and that the Constitution of the state prohibits her from voting. She intended to violate that prohibition, intended to test it perhaps, but certainly intended to violate it. She voluntarily gave a vote which was illegal and thus is subject to the penalty of law." And then he directed the jury to find her guilty without even letting them deliberate. Gentlemen of the jury, such men make me tired.
Me too. So some other things must have happened because you are, after all, rather feisty.
You may say so. Well, let's see, 1875 was a good year for me. My 4 children were grown. Well, Maud, the youngest, was still in high school. And I was elected president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. That year, the nation also was planning a large celebration for the next year's 1876, which was the centennial of the United States. So the National Women's Suffrage Association planned women's rights activities too. The centennial festivities included the first United States World Fair, which attracted millions of people to Philadelphia. I rented a summer headquarters for the National in Philadelphia, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and I wrote a Declaration of Rights for Women, and we had thousands of copies printed. We asked for permission to present that to President Ulysses S. Grant at the National July 4th celebration at Independence Hall. But we were refused, so we decided to go ahead and do it anyway. Whether President Grant wanted it or not. Access was tightly controlled, but we were able to get tickets, and we sat in seats behind the podium until the Declaration of Independence had been read. And then, risking arrest, we stormed the platform. The men who could have stopped us moved politely out of the way. President Grant had decided not to come, so we gave our declaration to Vice President Ferry and then ran out, tossing copies into the crowd. Then we went over to the Unitarian Church across the street, where, after a standing ovation, we had a woman's centennial celebration.
Wow, you were really within a national scene there. What else, or what other impact did you make nationally?
Let's see. In 1878, I bought a newspaper, the National Citizen and Ballot Box, and it soon became the official paper of the National Women's Suffrage Association. I wrote for other newspapers, too, across the country, sometimes about the Indian culture that I admired. About the same time, Mrs. Stanton and Susan and I began work on a history of the women's movement. Mrs. Stanton and I did the writing, and Susan was supposed to be our business manager. Some business manager. She was supposed to give us monthly statements of our financial reports, but in 9 years, she produced only one. And she cheated me out of some money on that project, too.
I don't think she likes Susan.
In 1886, I helped stage a demonstration at the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. The New York State Women's Suffrage Association was denied a chance to speak at that ceremony. No women were allowed on the island, but we did get permission to sail in the naval parade around the island.
Why would you protest the Statue of Liberty?
Well, we were protesting the fact that liberty was portrayed as a woman when women had so few rights in the United States. Well, the only boat we could find was a 2-story cattle barge, and you can imagine how that smelled. The captain promised to have it scoured before we used it, but unfortunately maybe he was impossible, but he didn't work. And several women, overcome by the smell, refused to board. But I overlooked it. I had a cow in Fayetteville, after all. About 200 of us sailed, with banners flying. We shouted slogans through megaphones, and some people cheered us on, and then there were others who, I don't want to repeat what they said here. In 1888, the National held an International Council of Women meeting in Washington. I was one of 7 organizers for that event. And at the International Council, I met Frances E. Willard, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was a charismatic leader in the fast-growing right-wing religious political movement. And by this time, Susan B. Anthony was willing to form partnerships with any groups that she thought might vote for women's suffrage. But having spent my entire life fighting for the separation of church and state, I'm afraid that I called Frances the most dangerous person upon the continent today. In 1889, I couldn't afford to go to the annual National Convention from Aberdeen, where I was living in the Dakotas, to Washington. That was because Susan B. Anthony denied me the funding, which she had approved in the past. She had a plan. On the last night of the convention, when most of the delegates had left, she pushed through a merger with the old conservative rivals, the American, and created the National American Women Suffrage Association. And they invited right-wing religious groups to join, too.
Oh, I wonder how that made you feel.
I was outraged. I left the new group and started my own, the Women's National Liberal Union. I put on a convention in Washington, and here is part of the speech I made there. The question at large is, what is to be done about women? They will persist in being born. The old heathen fashion was to bury the unwelcome female infants alive, throw them to the crocodiles, or expose them to die of cold and starvation. And I'm not quite sure, but we ought to return to those customs. It's quite certain they can't all marry, and those who do marry are not only compelled to support themselves, but also a husband and children. And they are not paid adequate wages. We don't want them to govern themselves. In fact, do we need them? So many of them in the world, anyway? There's been a mistake made somewhere, and I'm afraid it's in women's being born at all. But more seriously, folks, we are told the country is in a dangerous condition, with tens of thousands of uncultured immigrants yearly pouring onto its shores. We're told our flag is hissed by anarchists. We're told the experiment of free government in towns and cities is a failure. But what danger from ignorant immigrants is so great? What peril from anarchists so near? What experiment of free government such an utter failure as the admission of 4 new states in 1889, 4 new states in which women cannot vote? The danger menacing our country does not lie with the foreigners, nor the anarchists, nor in municipal mismanagement. Free institutions are jeopardized because the country is false to its principles in the case of one half of its citizens. We must look for the source of this perennial wrong. To a person of thought, that's easily found in early religious training. The Church, American, English, Greek, Protestant, Catholic, is the bulwark of women's slavery. Man is trained by the Church from infancy that woman is secondary and inferior to him, made for him to be obedient to him. And the same idea permeates Jewish and all Christian churches, all social, industrial, and educational life, all civil and religious institutions. Men have not yet learned to regard women as being of equal creation to themselves. Do not believe that she stands on a par with them in natural rights, even to the air she breathes. This government of the people, by the people, and for the people seems to be very much limited in the interpretation of the word people. The poor, the women, both married and single, the children, the Indians, and other unfortunate inhabitants are not people. The phrase should be changed to read, a government of rich men, by rich men, for rich men. It sounds like you feel familiar with that. In 1881, when I had to stop publishing my newspaper, the National Citizen and Ballot Box, I wrote a piece called The End Not Yet, to say farewell. And I'm sure that this will apply for many years into the future. To those who fancy we are near the end of the battle, or the reformer's path is strewn with roses, we say to them, nay. The thick of the fight has just begun. The hottest part of the warfare is yet to come, and those who enter it must be willing to give up father, mother, and comforts for its sake. Neither shall we who carry on the fight reap the great reward. We are battling for the good of those who shall come after us. They, not ourselves, shall enter into the harvest.
Well, that is true. A lot of that does sound familiar. And I noticed you included Indians in those who are ignored, and I understand that you were honored by the Mohawk Nation.
Yes. In 1893, I was made an honorary member of the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk and given the name She Who Holds the Sky. As an honorary member, I actually had voting rights in the Indian Nation. I never had the opportunity to use them. My book, the one here.
Want me to get it?
Yes, would you?
The one that you wrote?
It's the brown one, Woman, Church, and State. It was published in 1893, and it was a history that told how religion and government had oppressed women for centuries, right up to the present time. One example I cited was the state of Delaware, where in 1893, the legal age of consent for sexual activity was 7. I said that this Delaware consent law was passed just to allow villains to assault baby victims. Church and State is a powerful, Women, Church and State is a powerful book, which I say so myself, and it has been read and much admired. I donated a copy to the school library in Fayetteville. Well, a school board member sent it to a man named Anthony Comstock, who headed the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice.
Do you recognize that name? You might, because recently, as Republicans considered using what is known as the Comstock Act to prohibit the mailing of birth control medications.
Birth control medication? I've not heard of that.
Well, some things have changed.
Well, as for my book, Comstock condemned what he called its tales of lust and threatened to bring suit against anyone who put it in schools. He didn't care about 7-year-olds getting raped. He just didn't want people reading about it. Well, in response to that, I felt invigorated, although I had been sickly before. And that, 1893, was also the year when I got arrested. As I mentioned before, I had registered to vote in response to the passage of a law that allowed women in New York the limited right to vote. Some opponents of that law wanted to present a case against it, and they chose to issue a warrant for my arrest. I was arrested and jailed and found guilty as charged, but I didn't have to serve any time. My son-in-law, L. Frank Baum, was also writing books at that time, based on the stories, like The Wizard of Oz, that he had told to his 4 sons. I liked the stories too, and I urged him to write them down and get them published. And you know, I think if Frank Baum had not been such a popular author, I might never have been remembered at all. Mrs. Angelica Carpenter was writing his biography when she ran across some information about me, and so she wrote my biography too. I felt very proud when his first children's book came out in 1897. It's fun to think of the two of us writing about such different subjects under the same roof.
Well, that is amazing, all of your stories and the wonderful work you've done. So we realize we need to carry it on, right? Well, thank you so much. This has been enlightening and encouraging. I'm going to give you a little background on what happened next. Matilda died at the Baum's house in Chicago on March 13, 1898. Her daughter Maud took her ashes back to Fayetteville for burial. On her tombstone is one of her favorite sayings: "There is a word sweeter than mother, home, or heaven. That word is liberty." After Matilda died, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton deliberately wrote her out of history. And if you want to know how they did it, you will have to read this book, Born Criminal. It's by Angelica Shirley Carpenter. In the 1960s and early 70s, in that second wave of the women's movement, and there were feminist scholars who rediscovered Matilda. In 1993, scientist Margaret W. Rossiter coined the term the Matilda effect, referring to the fact that male scientists often take credit for the work of women. Today, Matilda's house in Fayetteville is a museum. It's open to the public. And today, the United States still doesn't have a functional equal rights amendment. Women don't get equal pay for equal work. And in some states, they are losing the right to control their own bodies. And that's just in the US. In many countries, women are still born criminal for wanting the most basic human rights, even just like movement or learning to read. So anyone wanting to change conditions would do well to study Matilda's life and techniques. She said, "The longer I work, the more I see that women's cause is the world's cause." I hope Matilda has inspired each of us to vote. Vote for women. Thank you.